Welcome to Issues That Matter. I'm Cynthia Pooler, and I'm so excited and pleased to introduce you to all my knowledgeable friends, Pippa, um, Diane, Charlotte, and Scott. And we're going to talk about the subject of pipelines and what's going on in Gaza and what's going on in the Ukraine. So, Charlotte, give us an overview again of your book and the importance of it.
Well, first of all, I can't resist putting it up to the camera if you can
Go
see
ahead.
it okay. The title of it is Follow the Pipelines, Uncovering the Mystery of a Lost Spy. That would be my father. And the Deadly Politics of the Great Game for Oil. Uh, my father, who I never knew, he died when I was 6 weeks old, was America's first master spy in the Middle East. He got recruited into the Office of Strategic Services during World War II, and that was in around 1944. And at the time of his mysterious death by plane crash in 1947, he was head of counterintelligence for the U.S. in the Middle East. He was based in Beirut. I was born in Beirut. Um, as I said, I didn't know him. I grew up back in the States, but then went back to Lebanon, did 2 years of high school, changed my life. And then later, after my mother died, I went back to Lebanon, became a journalist for the Beirut Daily Star. And it was during this time that I began to realize I was traveling all over the Middle East, uh, also in Gulf countries that were just beginning to emerge out of the sand. Um, and I began to think, gee, I'm kind of following my father's footsteps, and I wanted to know more about him. So, long story short, I began focusing on what his last mission was because I had his last report and his last letter home. And his mission was to Saudi Arabia. And the goal was for him to track the safest route for the pipeline to go from Saudi Arabia across the desert and end up in a terminal point on the Eastern Mediterranean. And that's what really struck me because the two options were to terminate in Haifa, which was still then Palestine, or Lebanon, which was just to the north. And he prevailed actually in the end, but there was all sorts of intrigue around this pipeline. And I found this great article in the New York Times, March 2, 1947, that was devoted entirely to the importance of the pipeline geopolitically, how America's allies were going to deal with it, because what it ended up doing by transporting Saudi oil to Europe, it was going to elevate the United States as a major power in the Middle East, replacing Britain and France, and they were seething with resentment over that, I might add. They were not happy about US getting an exclusive concession with Saudi oil. Now, the other thing that I need to mention, apart from the fact that the Syrians were very much opposed to this pipeline passing through Syria to terminate on the Mediterranean because they were anti-Zionist, they were very nationalistic at the time. And my father described this in his last report. And 2 years later, after his death, the CIA had its first coup d'etat. Most people think it was in Iran. No, it was Syria. They didn't. They wanted that Trans-Arabian pipeline to go through Syria, actually the Golan Heights, unobstructed. All right. So they got rid of Kuwatli, the president of Syria, and replaced him with a army chief who was amenable. That's when I began to realize that pipelines were very important for power. And they've even been called the arteries of power because the other important dimension is oil is the fuel of the military. This is all what I found out in my research. And this is why you don't hear about it. You don't hear the oil explanation to all these huge conflicts in the Middle East because, as my father once wrote, and this is in a declassified document, um, we must protect the oil at all costs. And this struck me um, because it was written in early 1944. Shortly afterwards, I could get into this, but shortly after that was written, there was a decision made by the Assistant Secretary of War. I think it was Assistant, or maybe it was Secretary John J. McCloy. The whole issue was whether they were going to bomb Auschwitz, the killing machine in Auschwitz. And McCloy argued, no, we're not going to bomb Auschwitz because it's too close to IG Farben, which was I mean, it would be a diversion. I'm sorry, he said it would be a diversion away from IG Farben. And in fact, it was very close. The whole point is, had Auschwitz been bombed, then the survivors would have been able to migrate down through Turkey to Syria and go into Palestine. And what I learned is that Ibn Saud did not want this. He didn't want it at all. He was anti-Zionist. So now we come up to the present. I mean, the irony of what's going on right now with Gaza, I mean, with Israel and Saudi Arabia trying to normalize their relationship, whereas back in the 40s, um, the whole reason that Auschwitz wasn't bombed was to protect the oil at all costs, and this was Saudi oil. So I found out that this meme that my father had written in a declassified document has continued all the way up to the present. I've been able to see this play out in the war in Iraq, in the war in Afghanistan, in the civil war in Syria, in the war in Yemen. I mean, this is the whole story, and no one's no one, well, people suspect oil is behind it, but they didn't have the details, so I got into the details. That's my summation.
Diane?
Well, I think others here may know more details about this, and my intention in running for office and otherwise is, how do you now solve these problems? It makes me think about why people are so vehemently opposed to the development of nuclear energy, for example, because of course energy is the key to economic development of any nation. So if you can prevent nations from having energy, then you stop them from developing. You look at what happened with Nord Stream, for example, and the effect that that's had on Europe and on Germany. But I think it's, in a sense, you feel like we're all running around here in the dark ages when we should have small modular reactors that could bring energy to anybody. People are working on breakthroughs in nuclear fusion, which we should have had in the 1980s. But any of these new technologies would completely break the stranglehold that the imperial powers wish to have over who can develop when and what and where. So those are just my comments right now. I'm sure that others of our guests have much more about the details of what's going on in the current conflicts. My view is that mankind should get above this nonsense and stop thinking this way, but that's perhaps a bigger problem.
Pippa?
Okay, thank you, Cynthia. Well, first of all, I just come back to Diane a little bit on the subject of nuclear, because not so far has anybody worked out what to do with the toxic waste product. The stuff that has a half-life of hundreds of thousands of years. They stick it all in yellow canisters and hope that the kids will be able to deal with it, or their kids, or some other kids. I mean, there's never been a solution for the toxic waste. And I would go further and say that we, humanity, supposedly intelligent, should not be developing any technology where there is no solution for the waste. They've kicked the can down the road on that, to the point where, certainly to my knowledge, in Scotland at the Drax nuclear power station, initially they thought, what should we do with this? They took it out to sea and dumped it in a trench off the coast of Scotland, and nobody knows where it is. So, I mean, we're doing this for the kids. Thank you. No nuclear. We could almost run the whole world on renewables. I say almost because the renewables are there, but the infrastructure to carry the energy is not there. It is geared up towards huge power stations and nuclear reactors. So the infrastructure needs to be improved greatly. The oil everybody's fighting about at the moment, whether it be in Syria or in Gaza or in Iraq, this oil is mainly for use by the military. Those tanks aren't going to run on electric power for a while, and there's very little development being done to make sure they can. So the oil is for the military, and therefore the military are making war in order to capture the oil for use for the military so that they can make more war for more oil. It's become a disgustingly vicious circle. And really, people talk about their departments of defense. There's no such thing. They're all departments for war. There is no department for peace. There are very few peace institutes or peace academies in this whole world. So peace, you can't get a lot of money out of peace, I mean, I think you could if our societies were restructured, but there's lots of money in war. The military-industrial complex, every time someone drops a bomb, they're making massive profits. America depends on war for most of its income, its arms sales, everything. We know, all of us, we know that those little babies in Gaza are being killed by American bombs and American aircraft. And, that makes the American government baby killers. And, well, Joe Biden, does it make you feel big that you can kill babies? I think that the whole thing is so immoral. It is beyond immoral. We haven't invented the vocabulary for it yet. And there's no time soon that it's going to stop. And I don't want to take up too much of all your time, but I will just say that there is a very simple ratio, really, to explain why so many women and so many children are being killed. If you take one man and you have 100 women, you can reproduce quite successfully, in theory, 100 times a year. But if you only have one woman and you have 100 men, that woman can only give birth about once a year, tops. You cannot increase the population. So, and of course, the children and the babies are the next generation, so they've got to go. So you see, mathematically, you go for the women and the children, particularly the girl children, because they are the ones who are going to be a threat in the future through their ability to reproduce. And, reproduction is one of the few weapons the Palestinians have. They can increase their numbers. They could increase them to the point where there would be an equal number of Palestinians in that landmass as there are Israelis. And if there ever was a two-state or a one-state or any form of political resolution and they all had votes, it would change the outcome of the government of Israel indescribably, for the good, as far as we can see at this moment. So yes, childbirth as a weapon, not of war, but as a weapon to produce some form of equality on one level at least. I have been to Gaza. I do know what it's like there, and it really is a hellhole. even on a good day. Hamas took a long time planning this particular foray. I think they're very clever people with very little in the way of equipment or machinery to construct the tunnels that they've dug, mostly manpower, I would imagine. They have, very little in the way of weapons generally, but they're holding out, and it's quite extraordinary. And just to finish up, to say that I think that Israel is pivoting towards Lebanon at the moment because it's losing the battle in Gaza, although, countless thousands are being destroyed in the process, the overall battle is being lost. So Lebanon is in its sights. There's been a lot of activity the north towards the Golan Heights, which Charlotte just referred to as being a key part of the pipeline. So you've also got to remember when the Ottoman Empire was carved up at the end of World War One, a lot of those lines you see on the maps, actually straight, nothing to do with rivers or geography, strangely straight. Those were lines where the pipelines were due to be built. So it's nothing to do with people. It always had something quite a lot to do with oil. I'll leave it there and maybe I can come back later on some of the other things.
Scott.
Well, I'll just echo what Charlotte said. I have limited experience in this.
Scott, can you speak up?
I can. I don't know. Can everybody hear me?
Yes.
All right. Look, my experience is limited to war and things related to war. But what I found is that almost every conflict that I've been involved in, directly or peripherally, has an energy component to it that serves as the foundation of that conflict. We can go back to the Gulf War. I don't know if people realize that it was one of the main reasons we fought Iraq in 1991 was because the Kuwaitis have been slant drilling, stealing oil from the Iraqi Wafra oil fields to the tune of $30 to $40 billion. At the same time, they were issuing exorbitant loans against the Iraqis to fund their war against Iran. When Iraq was seeking to rebuild its economy after the Iran-Iraq war, they needed two things to happen. One, they needed the Kuwaitis to renegotiate the loans. They thought it was ridiculous that Kuwait was holding the loans as leverage over their heads after they saved Kuwait from Iran. But two, they wanted the Kuwaitis to stop stealing their oil and dumping it on the open market because Kuwait, with the encouragement of the United States, was seeking to drive oil prices down below $14 a barrel. That was the magic number that Iraq had to sustain in order to be able to pay off the interest on the loans they had taken from the London consortium of banks. But Kuwait continued to dump oil on the markets, driving down the price of oil to $11 a barrel, putting Iraq on the verge of strategic bankruptcy. Iraq went to the Arab League in July of 1990 and begged them. They said, stop this. This is economic warfare. It's destroying Iraq. If you don't stop it, we're going to have to do something about it. Well, they didn't stop it. Iraq invaded Kuwait. Now, Iraq's invasion of Kuwait wasn't meant to be a general attack against the region. In fact, Iraq had signed, treaties with Saudi Arabia and all the other neighbors saying that we won't, we're not going to attack. But the United States went in and we cooked the books. There's a famous analyst for the Defense Intelligence Agency that talks about how he was flown to Saudi Arabia to show them photographs of the Iraqi buildup on the Saudi Arabian border to convince the king that the Iraqis were going to move down on the eastern Saudi Arabian oil fields and take over the oil fields. But as he was showing those photographs, the Iraqis were actually withdrawing from that line because they didn't want to threaten Saudi Arabia. So we showed the Saudis old photographs to convince them to allow us to create the conditions for the war because we needed to control all the oil. It was all about oil. when George Herbert Walker Bush first started to articulate why America was going to war against Iraq, he actually said it's because of the oil. And the response in America was so vociferously against this notion that he had to turn around and recalculate the equation. And that's when he turned it into a personal match. He said that Saddam Hussein is the Middle East equivalent of Adolf Hitler, who deserves Nuremberg like retribution. So it was always about oil. Everything was about oil. I do advisory. I'm an advisor to a group that discusses oil and energy, and I can tell you that the oil companies are so accustomed to being able to make fleets move and make armies move and make air forces move to secure to secure the oil supply for the world. That and war means nothing to these people. It's only the issue of continuing their ability to generate billions and billions and billions of dollars. And the oil isn't just for the war machine, it's for industry, but industry is increasingly military in nature. Um, but every war you can point at, it's very difficult to find a war that you can't find an oil equation. Let's take the Chechen conflict of the early 1990s. It was about control of the oil pipelines leading out of Chechnya and the money generated from that. Let's take the current Russian Ukrainian conflict. It's not just about the Russian oil pipelines going through Ukraine into Europe, but the Nord Stream pipelines, which we blew up. The bottom line, it was about Russian energy and how we can starve Russia out. What led to the collapse of the Soviet Union? America working with Saudi Arabia to collapse the price of oil so that Russia couldn't generate the income necessary to sustain the economic changes that they needed to survive. On and on and on. Oil component, gas component, energy component. Um, war, the fact of the matter is, wars today are fought about energy and water, but resources. Very few times is the real purpose of a war ideology or religion. These are justifications for war to disguise the reality that this is about energy. Energy is about money, and money is about power. It's about the people who hold the reins of power, who benefit financially from the energy, controlling the world. And this is where it's frustrating as for me as an American, because I'd like to believe that my country would only go to war to defend me, my interests, American interests. But we go to war to defend not national interests, but the interests of big oil. And big
And
oil is transnational in nature.
if I could just jump in, but what mother would want to send her husband or her son or daughter off to war if she knew that it was to benefit the oil companies? So that's why pretexts are needed with every war. The lies have to proceed because otherwise they wouldn't want to.
No, I agree. And then the pretexts get out of control. Just to give you an example, when we called Saddam Hussein, George Herbert Walker Bush called him the Middle East equivalent of Adolf Hitler, he made it impossible to negotiate with Saddam to bring in a termination. Regime change was the inevitable consequence because once you label somebody Hitler, you can't go back on that. In 1993, Saddam Hussein, I mean, I can tell you this because I sat in the meeting with the Iraqi oil minister as he mocked me. He said, "You weapons inspectors are history. You're the thing of the past. Bush is gone. Clinton's coming in. We are actively negotiating with Clinton's people now in Jordan so that when he comes into office, we are going to lift the sanctions. We're going to invite U.S. oil companies in, and we're going to begin that business." And the oil companies were all in favor of this. This is where ideology came in because having labeled Saddam Adolf Hitler, the Republicans couldn't back away. The Israelis were in. That the paradigm of the Middle East that the neoconservatives had envisioned was being threatened by normalcy, and reinviting Iraq back in. Iraq's oil had been eliminated from the market. The oil companies had adjusted. They had their price and their revenue generation dependent upon keeping Iraqi oil out of the market. And now Iraqi oil was threatening to come back into the market. So they disrupted it by faking an assassination attempt against George Herbert Walker Bush when he went to Kuwait. Never happened, manufactured out of the blue, totally fake. But by faking the assassination attempt, Clinton had to terminate his discussions about bringing back Iraq back in, lifting sanctions, instead attack Iraq and continue the conflict until its inevitable consequences.
Charlotte, when we talked last week, you talked about the Middle East, and you kind of talked about Ukraine a little bit, and you kind of like said there's a link between what's going on in Ukraine and what's going on in the Middle East. People know that there's two hot wars going on, but what's the linking factor?
Well, one of the linking factors is that because of the sanctions against the Russians and also the sabotage of the Nord Stream 2 pipeline, Europe is suddenly desperate for oil and natural gas. Russia supplied 40% of its natural gas. And I just want to add one thing, the whole Donetsk region where all the fighting is, Ukraine, just this is an aside, but Ukraine has the largest reserves of oil and natural gas in Europe next to Russia, if you want to consider Russia part of Europe, okay? It's loaded. And most of those reserves are in the eastern region where all the fighting is going on. Now, to get back to the connection, because the United States has been playing this game of, it's called the bypass game. It means we got to supply more oil and natural gas to Europe. We don't want Europe as it's so dependent on the Russians. Now the Ukraine war has happened. Europe is the winter is coming. They're looking all over the place, and Biden's been looking all over the place for alternatives since he was very much part of this war. So where are they looking? How about Israel? In 2000, the first amount of oil and natural gas was discovered off the coast of Gaza. And this was British gas that came in and did a survey. And yes, there was oil and natural gas there, a substantial amount. They thought at the time it would provide the Palestinian Authority with about $1 billion worth of revenue, and Arafat, who was then in charge, was very happy about that. Okay, so then in 2010, a much larger field, the Leviathan, was found off the coast of Israel. Meanwhile, the attacks by the Likud party against Gazans. They happened in two different periods. What the first period was in 2009, and the second major attack was in 2014. Both of these attacks were to prevent the Palestinians from getting royalties from the oil and natural gas, or even control over it. So what is happening now, in my opinion, is that this massive assault on Gaza is to wipe it out and to create an energy corridor. This has been on the books for some time. This is what Netanyahu has wanted. Netanyahu has wanted since the war in Iraq, since 2003. He sees Israel as the new Rotterdam. And so you're going to have pipelines running up the coast of the Eastern Mediterranean, providing that badly needed natural gas to Europe. And now, of course, because of the war in Ukraine, the effort to have this happen has only been intensified. And I was just looking, and what oil companies are interested in helping develop. Well, I know for one thing that Halliburton's in there already to help develop, and Halliburton does the supplies and the drilling and provides that logistical support. So that is the link. I think that explains why the Baza administration, Baza, the Biden administration has been, keeps stretching out the war, the genocidal war against Gaza, like saying, oh, you really have to confine your attacks better. But meanwhile, the attacks continue. I mean, Netanyahu is acting with complete impunity, and his defense minister has already called the Palestinians animals that have to be rid of. And that's the whole point. Just finish the job. Finish the job. Flatten it, create your new reality, bring in the Abraham Accords, forget about the Palestinians, run a Ben Gurion Canal, which would be an alternative to the Suez Canal, and run it from the tip of Gaza down through southern Israel, and then connect it to the Gulf of Aqaba, which will ultimately connect to the Red Sea, and create a whole new trade route in competition with the Suez Canal. That's been on the agenda for some time. I think that's the end game, and I think that Netanyahu, fascist that he is, doesn't care about how many people he kills, whether it's Israelis, and I'm sure Scott would like to talk about that. I've been reading Scott's material, whether it's Israelis or Palestinians. His end game is to create this new Israel.
Scott.
I don't want to get you kicked off of YouTube, Cynthia. So, well, I'll behave. But because you have to be careful what you say nowadays. Everybody's being attacked as anti-Semitic, and
Can you speak up a little bit?
I'm doing my best.
Okay.
But no, look, there's nothing you can say to justify what Israel's doing against Hamas today, and the crimes that have been committed against the Palestinian people for the past 75 years. I think at this juncture, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is for the moment going to be bigger than oil, because it's become so political. But at some point in time, um, the world is going to seek stability. Stability is defined by energy security, and energy security is derived from access to energy sources and the income derived. So if you're trying to negotiate a solution to the Palestinian Israeli issue, and you don't factor in um, the the reality of energy, then you're not solving the problem, because at the end of the day, whether or not there's going to be a Palestinian state, whether or not it's going to be a two-state solution or one-state solution, it's that outcome is going to be influenced by who's going to get the money off who's going to get the income from the gas fields off of the coasts of Palestine or Israel or whatever you want to call it, and where that gas is going to go. Right now, Israel has been working with Turkey. I mean, people ask the question, well, Erdogan supports Hamas, calls them a liberation organization, speaks valiantly about the Gazan people, and he's not doing a darn thing to stop the flow of Azerbaijani oil through Turkey into Israel, because he can't disrupt the business. The business is energy security. Israel needs to develop the gas fields. They need to develop the gas fields with a market in mind. The market they have in mind is Europe. To get to Europe, you go through Turkey. Turkey is going to be the energy hub of the region. Turkey can't afford to alienate Israel from that. So this will control, energy controls every aspect. And this is a sad thing, because Pippa, you probably know this better than I do. The world will never line up behind the Palestinian people. They never have, they never will. And once again, the Palestinian people, I believe, are going to be abandoned at the side of the road. Some bones will be thrown in their direction. But until we break the death grip that energy companies have on the world's paradigm of energy security, this is why, you know, alternative energy is such a threat, because the security paradigm of alternative energy, of green energy, is fundamentally different than the security paradigm of fossil fuels. And nobody wants to give up their hold on power. This is, and we're getting ahead of ourselves here, but I'll just say this. The Chinese are probably the only nation in the world that has a viable path to zero carbon or low carbon emissions. Why? Because China can do whatever the hell that China wants to do. And what they're doing right now is they're making massive investments in coal and gas energy, not because that's the direction they're going, but because they're building their economy and a parallel green energy on a mass scale parallel to it, so that at the point in time in the future, they can turn off the carbon and turn on the green, and it's working. It's there. Look what they're doing with electric vehicles. It's a paradigm shift. I mean, it is fundamentally different than anything we're doing here in the West. In the West, we talk about, oh my God, the expense of replacing batteries. In China, they're saying, what are you talking about? We swap them out like a gas station. All we do is we drive into a battery changing facility. They drop out the uncharged battery, they bring in the charged battery, and you drive away. The convenience of it. Everything is convenient, Chad. They're making this alternative energy convenient, and they're doing it on a massive scale. They're coming up with hydrogen fuels technologies on a massive scale. Nobody else is doing it. Why? Because of the power and the control of the fossil fuel energies on everything we do. They control. I probably get fired from my other job for saying this, but this whole COP thing, conference they had in Dubai, okay, it is a joke. The conference was made so that the energy companies can guarantee there will never be a viable clean energy policy, that fossil fuels will be relevant forever, because that's how you control the world. You can't, the existing power elites cannot control the world with green energy. They can only control the world with fossil fuels. And so they will make fossil fuels as relevant as possible. But in order to do that, they've hijacked the green, clean energy forum, and then they destroyed it. It was a joke. It was a horrible joke what was going on in Dubai. It wasn't serious. John Kerry is not a serious man. If you think John Kerry cares about green energy, then I have a bridge in Brooklyn I'd like to sell you. John Kerry is bought and paid for by the oil industry. Every official from Europe was bought and paid for by the oil industry. The entire COP conference is about sustaining fossil fuels. That's its agenda. Everything else is just window dressing and trap. That's the grip that they have on it. The only nation in the world that has positioned itself to beat that is China. And yet we want to go to war against China. I wonder why, Charlotte.
Great game of oil is alive and well. Oil and natural gas now. And by the way, I just wanted to read this quote, just so if anybody doubted what I was saying about the connection with the wars in Gaza and oil. This is from a military hardliner named Moshe Dayan, who would become the Israeli defense minister between 2013 and 16. And what he said was that likely the revenue, if the oil and gas revenue went to the Palestinians, it would not likely trickle down to an impoverished Palestinian people. Rather, it's clear that they would use that money to fund terror. That which they use this argument over and over. The Palestinians are terrorists, and the money they can't develop. They shouldn't be allowed to develop because that'll just increase their terrorism. And then he says it's clear, and I thought this was interesting, that without an overall military operation to uproot Hamas's control of Gaza, no drilling work can take place without the consent of the radical Islamic movement. So both those wars, I have to repeat, were designed to prevent the Palestinians from getting access to the oil and gas off their own homeland. And anyway, that's all I have to say. Oh yes, and one other thing I would really recommend people getting a hold of. This is an UNCTAD report. This is the UN Committee on Trade and Development. It came out a report in 2019 analyzing the whole conflict between the Palestinians and the Netanyahu government. And they say point blank, you cannot separate. You cannot. In fact, I'll just read from this. You really should look this up if you can get a hold, because it's a very long report and it ties in the whole thing. And it says the disputes and tensions involving oil and natural gas cannot and should not be separated from the political context of what was going on in Israel and Gaza, and the fact that the period when the natural gas discoveries were made coincided with a number of important political developments. I'm not going to go into them. The Intifada was one of them. Israel's disengagement from Gaza and allowing Hamas to get in there. You may want to address that, Scott. But this is a very valuable report, and I would recommend it to people to understand this missing element of the whole struggle.
One quick question. You guys are talking primarily about the Middle East. The Ukraine war started a few years before that. How does oil and natural gas fit into the war in Ukraine?
Definitely.
Well, it does. It does,
Oh,
definitely.
Go ahead.
Go for it, Tiffany. Go for it,
But but even more than that, you know, Ukraine has one of the world's largest deposits of lithium, which is not too difficult to get hold of there. So, as you all may probably do know, that America and American companies such as BlackRock or Blackwater or Black, whatever they're called these days, already owns 2/3 of Ukrainian agricultural land. Actually, the most fertile land. So there's a lot at play there, not just the oil, not and you know this whole business of Ukrainian nationalism was whipped up on purpose, and in fact it was done in record time, from something like 2004 and the 2014 Maidan revolution, which turned so desperately wrong, and the split between those who are inclined towards Europe and those who are Russian speakers and of Russian blood. It's all manufactured in order to get to the natural resources of the region, and also to capture the region in order to bring the oil closer to Europe. We can see this. This is why we had people such as Annalena Baerbock, who's the foreign minister equivalent of in Germany, a Green, would you believe, who's lost all integrity. Oh, when she said we are at war with Russia, I mean, this is all a nonsense. Everything is a nonsense. It's clear it's about energy. And Scott's quite right when he says that China has done the most to develop renewable energy. Absolutely. Where we're trying to make in our countries it difficult, unpalatable to have an electric car. You know, all the negative publicity, not enough charging stations, the expense of it, Then you get the little pictures of these poor little kids in Central Africa digging out lithium and how cruel you are to have an electric car because of this. I mean, on and on and on, making it almost feel immoral to have renewable energy. So there are fights on many points. And Ukraine and Charlotte had studied these pipelines. And by the way, I have ordered your book, Charlotte, because I thought it sounded fascinating. Um, these pipelines that are crisscrossing the world and Europe, it is everything to do with power. Renewable energy could be community owned, community run, community organized energy. I mean, wow, who thought of that? Communities having their own sources of power. It would completely disenfranchise the big oil companies, and they will fight tooth and nail until something massive happens to change the paradigm. And that something massive may well be going on in the Middle East right now because America, for all its strength and military might, is losing every battle, every war it has fought one way or another. And I don't think this is going to be any exception. In fact, I mean, whatever America does in the Middle East right now is going to be a big mistake. I mean, they're trying to pretend Ukraine didn't happen and find words to explain, how it didn't turn out. But everything America's doing is a big mistake. And with the advent of BRICS, who are, by the way, the countries who have the raw materials on the whole, this is suddenly a very important conglomeration of countries getting together with the oil, with the croplands, with the lithium. All these things are bundled together in these countries. This is changing the paradigm. And we will see the flailing old colonial racist countries of Europe diminishing as they are now before our eyes, and America will be on its feet, following them closely on its feet. So we have, great opportunities now. And just one last thing, and that is we're seeing, I'm coming back to Gaza, but and less so for Ukraine. You have to really look for alternative media to find out what's really happening in battles in Ukraine. In Gaza, we're seeing real-time genocide. And the young people are not liking what they see. They don't want it to go on. They're picking it up. They're out there on the streets grabbing the megaphones. It is heartening, so heartening to see this happening in real time and see people going out twice a week, every day, protesting about this genocide that we see on our screens. And there's no way you can sell genocide. So I really look forward to the downfall of the perpetrators of this horror upon horrors. Um, and But it's not just the US. We've got to think about NATO in this. And I'm just bringing this in very quickly because there was a law passed in the United States a couple of days ago for making it illegal for a president of the United States to pull out of NATO, which I thought was rather interesting because, of course, NATO doesn't have an army of its own. It doesn't have any military bases of its own because you're a key person for NATO. So Trump, who's talked about not liking NATO too much, is they've passed a law now so that the president can't pull out of NATO. NATO being the front man, of course, for all these wars that have been happening.
Diane?
Yeah, one, I'd just like to agree with Pippa on 2 points. On the question of the Palestinian people who, in a way, have become the conscience of the world. And we are seeing the United States extremely isolated. And 2, the horror of population war. Something was rattling around in my head, which I looked up between George Ball and then William Paddock. I don't know if you know the name, but in the 1970s, he said that we have to cut the population of Mexico by half. And someone said, well, how do you propose to do that? He said, seal the border and watch them scream. And then they said, well, that won't just, he said, you do it by the usual means, famine, war, and pestilence. And so if you look, I mean, this is not unknown. This is deliberate genocide, depopulation policy. And one of these people, I couldn't find the quote, I think it was El Salvador, but I may be mistaken, explicitly spoke of killing women of childbearing age. So they're not even subtle about this. Uh, so I think that's really important, which is why you're getting the backlash. I would just like to say, we'll take it up another time, but I don't think we should bury the nuclear waste either. And you actually can reprocess about 96% of it. We abandoned that long ago. China's now working on fusion, and also they just brought online the first in the world, fourth generation molten salt cooled reactor, which physically impossibly cannot melt down, physically can't melt down. It's just if you allow people to be creative, since most people, I think, I can't say all, but most people would like to live long, happy lives. I think we are capable in dialogue of discovering all kinds of solutions to these problems. And obviously, the tiny percentage who have the oligarchical outlook, who think they should be entitled to control all the rest of us, want to prevent us from having exactly that dialogue or making these discoveries or ever bringing them to bear so that we might get out of their grip.
We've been talking for quite a while this morning, so I'm going to ask all of you for final thoughts. Diane?
That's it. I also am cautiously optimistic. My only fear is that the United States doesn't, rather than change its ideology, which will lead us to disintegrate, we might destroy the entire planet. So I'm hoping that we can avert that enough people will be in the streets that we get a policy change instead of destroying the world.
Pippa?
Well, there is this saying, you reap what you sow. And most of us kind of live by that to some extent. I think in the case of war, famine, genocide, I hope I hope these people who are sowing these seeds of evil and hardship and murder, I hope they reap what they sow.
Charlotte?
When Winston Churchill decided in 1911 that he was then First Lord of the Admiralty, which means he was in charge of the Navy. When he decided that he had to convert the Navy's fuel from coal to oil, he predicted that we will have to fight on a sea of troubles because Britain had plenty of coal and didn't have any oil. And where did they go? They went to Iraq. And that was a first-class war aim during World War I. Get the oil of Iraq. What happened afterwards, they had to figure out how to ship it. So they built a pipeline, and it's on my book right here. I have the map. They built the pipeline to Haifa. Okay. And later on, Netanyahu, in 2003, right after the invasion by Bush, wanted to reopen that pipeline, which had been closed since 1948 and Israel's War of Independence. And he said, "Oh, we're going to see the oil flowing to Haifa, and it's not a pipe dream." Well, it still is a pipe dream, but the sea of troubles continues. My hope is that all those climate activists begin to unite with the peace activists. So we have more people engaged in taking on the powers that be, and it's going to be a very, very long struggle. And I worry about wars over lithium. Pippa, I agree. That's going to be the next place, but maybe we can get beyond it. But raising awareness is really crucial, and I thank you for this show, which hopefully will help people understand a little better the world we're living in.
Scott?
Well, first of all, I just want to thank everybody for what they've said. I've learned a lot here today, so hopefully the people watching will learn. Charlotte, your book should be read by everybody.
Can you
Pippa,
just speak up just a little bit? I'm sorry.
well, I'm speaking right into the microphone, so there's not much
Okay.
more I can do than that. But in Diane, you keep fighting the good fight, holding people to account. I'm not very optimistic. about the future. In fact, I'm extraordinarily pessimistic, and one of the reasons why is that this war industry that we talk about is purely the construct of democracies. It is an American problem. It is a European problem. It is a Japanese problem. It is a Korean problem. It's all of these nations that we have put out there to say this is the best we can do. Democracy is the height of, um, you know, human aspirations. If you are only a democracy like us, you will succeed. And then we put down everybody who's not like us. We call them autocracies. We call them dictatorships. But put 2 points on a map and say one's autocracy, one's a dictatorship. Are you saying the entire world either gravitates one direction or the other? Or is there perhaps middle ground, people who don't operate that way? And the failure to identify them properly means that you can't work with them. Russia is a clear example. Russia is not a dictatorship. No, it's not a Jeffersonian democracy either. Russia is Russia. It's a Russian reality that resides somewhere in the middle. But we can't deal with that reality. We can't deal with what China is. Nobody can accurately define what the hell's going on inside China. It ain't democracy, but it is. It's not a dictatorship, but it is. It's something different. So we just call it communists. We can't define what's going on in Russia. We call it dictatorship. But it's working. And you know what the thing is? The military industrial complex does not own Russia and China, which is why we don't seek to define them properly. Democracy, it isn't democracy. What's happening here in America isn't democracy. It's plutocracy. It's something other than the will of the people being expressed, because the will of the people has been hijacked by energy security interests. Big oil, big gas, linked to the military industrial complex, owns America, owns Europe, drives America, drives Europe. And so there will be war, there will be starvation, there will be pestilence. Hundreds
What a
of millions
cheery
of people
thought.
Pardon?
I said, what a cheery thought.
I'm not here to cheer anybody up. I'm being
No.
realistic. And
Yeah.
and the only way it changes is if we, the people, become the democracy that we claim we are. Stop electing Joe Biden's to office. Stop electing Donald Trump's to office. Stop electing Chuck Schumer's to office. Stop electing whoever the heck my other idiot senator from New York is that Diane's running to replace.
Kirsten
Gillibrand.
Gillibrand.
Stop electing Rubio. Stop electing everybody who's in the United States Senate today to office. Stop electing everybody who's in the United States Congress today to office, because they have all failed. None of them represent the interests of the American people. All of them represent the interests of lobby groups, and these lobby groups are all 100% controlled or influenced by energy security interests linked to the military industrial complex. And until we divorce ourselves from that, we will continue to be pushed towards conflict, disease, pestilence, starvation. That's our future. How do we change it? Take control of our country. But we can't do that unless we divorce ourselves from this cocoon of comfort that we wrapped ourselves into. We're addicted to being comfortable. It's Christmas season. My family's like every other family, bankrupting itself to put presents under the tree, to have a good holiday season. I'm not condemning that, but what I'm saying is we're doing that while genocide is being carried out in Palestine using weapons funded by us. We're doing this while hundreds of thousands of people are being slaughtered in Ukraine using weapons funded by us. Until we recognize that we are responsible for everything that happens. We, the people of the United States of America, are responsible for everything that happens. And until we take ownership of it and say, yes, I am to blame, therefore we put the impetus upon us to fix it. As long as we say this is somebody else's problem, it will never be fixed, because the people whose problem it is big energy, military industrial complex, and this is what they want. This is what they need to stay in power. So yeah, I'm not very optimistic. Happy New Year.
And
Thank you.
Vermonters elected Bernie Sanders, and he's not perfect, but he's better than a lot of them. And, you know, if we have more people, Diane get elected and other people who take on big corporations and the oil companies will be better off.
So I want to thank Pippa, Charlotte, Diane, and Scott. You guys are my core group to to talk about truth while the mainstream media talks about sugarcoats everything and tells all kinds of lies. So I want to thank you. I want to thank you. You guys are great. I look forward to talking with you again. Pippa, Charlotte, Diane, and Scott. So you guys have a happy Christmas season, and we'll talk again as events arise. Thank you. Have a great day. And if you like this show, please subscribe to my YouTube channel. Bye.